Heartily welcome to Mela House. The topic today we have is politics, history, and culture. In a way, these three words have been the center of establishing this house from the beginning. So we have been having activities from December last year onwards. Uh, but now, for this weekend, we are focusing especially on politics, history, and culture. Um, we are very, very grateful and thankful to have two consummate writers, Per Petersson and Tariq Ali, with us. Um, I can say a little bit about practical part of it. I think we will have hour and a half, probably 1 hour, and then we can have a little break, probably 10 minutes or so, and then we probably can have another session on international affairs, India, Pakistan. We have been saying Latin America, Palestine, but the first part is on politics, history, and culture. Yesterday we had one session on Palestine, and there was some young artists from Palestine who were here, and I quoted yesterday Mahmoud Darwish's two lines. Where should we go after the last frontiers? Where should the bird flies after the last sky? These are the lines actually which have inspired very many younger generations of Palestinians. The younger one Palestinian artist yesterday, I just saw that quite a lot of work that she's doing is very much inspired by Mahmoud Darwish's work. There's another thing which is interesting. We also took out the name of Nazim Hikmat. Now, in the Jamhuriyet, the main Turkish newspaper, the cartoonist Thanural, he is the guy who has been very much inspired by Nazim Hikmat, and he's very much active when the military rule is there in Turkey, but he always says that I become jobless when there is a democracy. Illustrating a little bit about the connection between history, politics, and culture. I would like first to ask Per Petersson to read from one of his novels, and then we will have Tariq Ali to speak on the issue, and then we will have question and answers before we have a small break. So, Per Petersson, please.
Okay. I'll see if I can see anything. This is from a novel. I'll do it in English, for the courtesy, because you're not so good in Norwegian, I think. No. It's from a novel I published in Norwegian in 2008, and it's supposed to be the political one, the one. And it's about not my alter ego, but my stuntman, Arvid Jansen, who has the frames of his life is like mine, but he doesn't necessarily do what I do. Usually he takes more blows than I do, in more concentrated form, like, well, you will see in the book. I have to talk like this. Is that the best? Oh my God. I'll see. Many years before, in the early 70s, I went to a college in the Dærdinga district of Oslo on the corner of Dærdinggata or Göteborggata. In order to get there, I had an almost ridiculously short distance to walk every morning because I had a small flat right down the road from the college at Carl Berners Plass. I had just turned 20. It was the first place I lived which was not my childhood home, the terraced house in Veitvet where I grew up in the late 50s and 60s. And I had moved out as soon as I got my student loan. That was what you did back then, whether you wanted to or not, if you were allowed to go further, as it still was called in our street and in many other streets. The first thing I did was to go into town and buy a stereo with some of the money, a TR-200 Tandberg amplifier, a Lenko record player, and a couple of 20-watt loudspeakers of a make I can no longer recall, but the sound was superb. And to be honest, the whole thing was identical to the stereo my eldest brother had put together and bought for his student loan. I was going through a phase where I copied him a lot. Not in everything, of course. I was a communist in those days, a Maoist, which he was not. But he was so talented with his hands, with carpentry, drawing and painting, that it did not even occur to me to try and emulate him. Instead, I read books, many books, and I guess to him it looked so intriguing and intense the way I lost myself in those books that sometimes he tried to copy me, and that made me happy. If I walked from the college at the corner and down Göteborggata, which I often did, I soon reached the Freja chocolate factory. My mother worked there. She stood at the assembly line in confectionery 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, plus overtime, and had done so for many years. All over Dærdinga and Rodløkka there was a smell of chocolate, of cocoa, in the morning especially when the air was sharp and a little damp maybe, and it was only when I had been out drinking too many pints the night before that I found the smell unpleasant. Otherwise, there was a feeling of comfort about it that brought back to me certain days in my childhood with certain faces attached and family gatherings with tables laid and tablecloths and the slanting sun through the gleaming white blinds, and then me in the middle of it all with this sudden feeling that everything around me was so fine, so perfect. Sometimes in the late nights in my small flat at Carl Berners Plass in Dærdinga, I allowed that feeling to well up from the past, and then I would long for my childhood with such teeth-grinding intensity that I almost frightened myself. Just a sip. When classes were over, I was just fed up sitting in the canteen, I would often stroll down Göteborggata and turn right towards Dærdinga Stadium, where the workers' entrance to Freja was, and I would stop and lean against the brick wall surrounding the factory, and they smelled good, those bricks. They smelled of nature, smelled of places I had been with my father, the forests of Östmarka, Lillomarka. And I gaped up at Arnold Haukeland's heavy, shiny, slowly rotating metal sculpture on a plinth near the entrance. It had been there only 2 or 3 years at a time and was supposed to be a wind harp, and sounds were meant to fold out from it when the wind blew like music, I had been told, but no music had ever been heard as far as I knew. I smoked my Petter cigarette that I rolled myself, and I had all the time in the world in a way I have never had since. I stood in the sunshine and waited for my mother, who would soon come from the huge building and walk along the flagstone path to the gate when her shift was over. I could see her from afar when she came through the door, and every time she did, I found myself thinking of Rudolf Nilsson's poem, which begins, "Long had I seen you as you came, for always did I know when you were near," which, strictly speaking, was a poem to his girlfriend some time back in the 20s. But I thought about it because of where I was, right between Dærdinga and Rodløkka and Grünerløkka, on the eastern side of central Oslo, which, after all, was Rudolf Nilsson's territory, just outside a factory where many of the girls he knew had probably worked. And even if it was my mother who was walking towards the gate and not my fiancée, then surely she was near to me, as it says in the poem. It felt that way. I straightened up, left the wall to support itself, and called out, "Freja chocolate!" "Not for me," she called. "Freja toffee!" "Not bloody like Lee," she said. blushing because the security guard was listening and laughing at us. "So, what are you doing here?" she said in a hushed voice when she reached the gate and the guard had let her out. "Are you broke?" she said. Of course I was. I always was. But I said, "What? Are you insinuating that I've been standing here waiting for my mother who is coming from the factory exhausted after a hard day's work just because I happen to be a bit broke, and then hope that she might spare me some change? Honestly, mother." "How much do you need?" she said. I shrugged. "Look here," she said, and stuck her hand into her small handbag, found her worn brown purse, which she opened in a furtive manner that was studied and practiced over many years to prevent inspection from a nosy husband who no longer had the economic power in the family. And she deftly eased out 100-kroner note she had folded into a tiny chip, which she pressed into my seemingly reluctant palm. "Take it," she said. I saw at once what kind of note it was. Jesus Christ, mother, 100 kroner, that's too much. And in fact it was. In comparison, my rent was 170 kroner a month. "And we'll say no more about it," she said. "Not a word to your father either." "Him I never see," I said. "That's not entirely his fault, is it?" my mother said. And she was right about that, and it was fine. I would not tell him anything, why would I? And there was no doubt the money came in handy. But the reason I was there that day was not just the fact that I was broke, not at all. Being broke was a way of life. I hardly noticed anymore. I was there because I had something to tell her, something she could not have known and would never have guessed. "Why don't we have a coffee before you go home?" I said, "at Bergerson's." And it was such an unusual suggestion that she said yes without thinking twice. What we normally did was walk up together to Göteborggata, along Daringata to Carl Berners Plus, past the Ringen Cinema where I watched Sorrow's Fighting Legion in 2 parts when I was 11, on 2 Saturdays with an unbearably long week in between. And then we would cross the junction and walk up Grensevine to the underground station while we talked about books we had read, new films we had seen, and old films we had seen again, such as Saturday Night and Sunday Morning with the young Albert Finney in the lead, which that very week had been on TV. Mm-hmm. My mother liked him a lot, Albert Finney, when he stood there at his lathe in the bicycle factory right at the start of the film with his shirt sleeves rolled up and bluntly declaring what he thought of the older workers and the way they were stuck in the mud of the pre-war years and all the things he definitely was not going to waste his life on. And there was no bloody way that he wouldn't ever allow himself to be kept down like they had been. "I'd like to see anybody try to grind me down. That'll be the day. What I'm out for is to have a good time. All the rest is propaganda," he said throughout his tight lips, and of course that was so much childish nonsense. My mother knew that better than anyone, yet she waved her glowing cigarette, and like Albert Finney in the factory concourse, she said, "All the rest is propaganda," in a rather loud voice right there on Carl Berners Plus, with narrow eyes and rolling R's and a sudden dark laughter that made me a bit anxious, though I too thought it was a cool thing to say. Then we changed the subject and started talking about the foreman in confectionery who took liberties with the female workers, and there were almost nothing but female workers at Freia, or at any rate in confectionery. She couldn't stand him any longer, the slimy bastard, and was now planning a counterattack, and she and I discussed how such a counterattack might be carried out. We were walking up to Bergerson's cafe, which in fact was not its name. It's just called Bergerson because a man called Bergerson sat on a chair in the corner by the window every single day reading the same newspaper. "Look, there's Bergerson," the staff would say. The cafe was in a short street which ran behind the Ringen Cinema and was an extension of Tromsøgata and bore the same name, but here it turned into a blind alley, an almost anonymous place. Once inside, we ordered 2 coffees and a Napoleon cake and took off our coats and hung them on the coat stand by the entrance, and I was already away explaining to her what was happening in my life. that I had decided to stop attending the college at the corner of Därengata and Göteborggata, where I had been a student for 2 years with my student loans and stereo and late nights with pints of beer and everything that went with it, because the Communist Party I was a member of had launched a campaign to persuade as many of its members as possible to become industrial workers. Not by force or anything, but a man from the Central Committee had come to my small flat and had spoken passionately for a good while and explained to me how the new great war would soon be upon us, maybe even early in New Year. When you consider how the Soviet Union was arming itself, surely that was something I had realized after this year's summer camp on Hoya. And then it made no sense, did it, to remain where I was right now? Surely we all wanted to be with the boys, didn't we? Where they were. That was the expression he used, the boys. And the boys, with boys he meant the industrial workers, and he pointed with conviction out of the window into the world, but in fact in the wrong direction. For he was not pointing to where my mother was laboring only a few blocks away as an industrial worker and was one of the boys, so to speak, even though the majority were women in that factory. Nor did he point to where my father worked as an industrial worker and was one of the boys only a few stops away on the underground. What he pointed at was the Munch Museum at the end of Finnmarksgata. I often went to the Munch Museum on Sundays to stand before the colorful, soft yet sinister paintings I loved so much, and I really didn't want to disappoint anyone. That's the way I've always been, so it was easy to tell where it was heading. Only a week after that conversation, I attended a meeting at the college along with other students who shared my view of the world and of politics, and I was the one who gave the talk about how important it was for the party to grow deep roots in the working class in times such as these. It was a fairly good talk, but I could not shake off the feeling that the working class I spoke of was not quite the same as the one my mother and father belonged to on a daily basis. They resemble each other, it was true, but they had different qualities and, strictly speaking, belonged to two separate worlds. This made me a little uncomfortable, but I must have been the only one who noticed, because when I finished, they all slapped me on the back and said it was a damn fine speech, and how interesting it had been to listen to it, and I do not know which houses and streets they grew up in, the other students who attended the meeting. But when it was over, I was the only one to declare I would give up my place at college. And that I did. It was the same as when I was a Boy Scout. I was the only one in the Roe Deer Patrol who took the Scouts' oaths seriously. In many ways, it was the same. All this I tried to tell my mother. I had hung my coat on the coat stand. I could see the lady from behind the counter on her way towards us with our coffees and Napoleon cakes on a tray. And as I turned in my chair to sit face to face with my mother, during this moment we had to ourselves, and the words still flowing from my mouth, I suddenly saw the flat of her hand come sweeping across the table like a shadow and hit me on the cheek. And the sound it made was the loudest sound in the room. Outside the window was a man unloading crates of flowers from his van for the shop next door. The sun touched the brick wall of an apartment building across the street. Two girls came cycling on their way home from school with their bags on the pannier. They were no more than 10 years old and looked a bit cold in their flimsy dresses. And deep inside me, I felt the old yearning for a sister. And if I had had a sister, my life would have been different, and I would not have been the person sitting here at this moment at Bergerson's Cafe. But of course, I had only brothers, 3 of them even, and my cheek stung. I could feel it turn red and hot, and I did not know what to do or what to say. I stared down at the table. I stared at the counter from the corner of my eye. I saw my mother stand up from the chair. The room was completely silent. Only the hum from the soft ice machine could be heard, and the lady with the tray froze halfway to our table before she came all the way over, carefully put down the tray and vanished. And then I remembered the 100-kroner note I had put in my pocket, and I pulled out the well-folded note. Here, I said, I guess you want this back. I felt the other cheek beginning to glow. I looked up. She stood with her coat over her arm, her face pale, and her eyes were moist. You idiot, she said, and then she left. Yep. I don't know if that was sort of kind of a kickoff for you. Maybe not. Not bullseye, maybe not. No.
Well, can I just say a few words? Tariq Ali's last book is Dilemmas of Lenin. It's a book he has also spoken in Stavanger yesterday about on the 100 years of Russian Revolution. We know Tariq from the 70s, 60s as an activist, chair of the Oxford Union, film writer and filmmaker, television producer, and above all, actually, besides many novels, and some of the novels have had huge awards. In Spain, on the pomegranate of the trees, and but above all, we remember Tariq Ali as an activist from the 60s. Tariq was one of the three leaders of the whole upsurge and revolutionary time of Europe in the 60s. But for Norway, Norway knows Tariq from years back in the 60s. But our struggle, immigrants' struggle against racism is also which owe Tariq Ali very, very much. Tariq Ali, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Khaled, and especially thank you, Per, for being on the platform and doing the reading. It's in fact a very good place to start from, chapter 5 in your novel. It was this novel, whose title is taken from a poem by Mao Zedong, who was, by the way, in case people didn't know it, he wrote good poetry. It's people can disagree with him on many things if they wish, but he was a fine poet, and many Chinese literary critics who were not communists have written about his poetry as a young intellectual, that is. And this was the first book by Per I read, and I loved it. I really liked it very much, and after finishing reading it, many things struck me about it. Working class life, real working class life, imagined working class life, the fact that Maoism for some reason was very dominant on the Norwegian left, something I have never completely understood, compared to other countries, even in Scandinavia, that they were very dominant here. Recent peasant pass, maybe, or I don't know what, but it was very, and the book brought all that back to me. The fact that thousands of people marched with lit torches to the Chinese embassy when Mao Zedong died, etc., etc. So I gave, after I had finished reading this novel, just to finish this story, I gave it as a present to a Chinese woman who was one of the leaders of the Tiananmen Square uprising in 1989. And I said, just read it. I'm not going to say anything about it. And tell me what you think afterwards. And she rang me up 2 weeks later and said, I read it in one sitting, and it's incredibly powerful and very moving, and it had a deep effect on me. Do you know him? I said, no, I don't know him. But so I'm glad I finally have met you.
I just add something, because some of my books are translated into Chinese, except this one. They won't take it because of a description of what happens on Tiananmen Square.
Of course.
Yes, so sorry, we like it, we're sorry, we can't do it.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true. It remains a very sensitive subject for them. And this friend of mine, was slightly older than the other students. She was one of the leaders. She was the woman, name is Wang Dawa Chawa, who suggested at a crucial meeting of the Tiananmen Square committee that they shouldn't go for a frontal assault or be provocative, but that because the Chinese party was itself divided on how to deal with it, and she said one faction is offering a negotiated solution and we should take it. That's the most we can get now. But alas, she was outvoted. She's an extremely intelligent person. But the fact that this book is still not published in China shows the effect, the interrelationship of politics and culture. There's still some things which can't be written about in that very great and increasingly important country. Khalid mentioned the latest book I've written. It's called The Dilemmas of Lenin. And one reason I wrote it was, of course, to commemorate the centenary of the Russian Revolution, which happened 100 years ago. But also because many of the problems he confronted in very different times are the ones we can confront today. So the subtitle of the book is The Dilemmas of Lenin, Terrorism, War, Empire, Love, Revolution. In different forms, these problems have not gone away in our world. They appear very different because they are. We live in a completely different time. Lenin created a time which became known as an epoch of wars and revolutions. And we live in a time of counter-revolution, if one is to be brutally honest. Of wars, certainly, and counter-revolutions on many, many levels, including the cultural level, which is why writing books which say something different, which try and stimulate someone's mind, rather than a book which can just be read and thrown away on a plane or whatever, is an act of resistance these days, I always argue. And this act of resistance is extremely important, not so much for the generations, or my generation, but for the generations to come. Because without understanding history, you can neither understand its victories and the defeats that have been imposed on movements in the past. Oscar Wilde once said that a world which doesn't have utopia on its map is not a world worth living in. And often it seems today that we are living in this world, but in fact we are not, because on the face of it, things are completely awful, really bad. We have an American president whose contact with reality is limited. I mean, this has happened before with other US presidents as well, Reagan, but they were not confronted with the necessity to tweet their lofty thoughts to the world at large. Technology, modern technology, has made that very possible. That's on the one hand. And the exchanges between the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and Ronald Reagan, you put them side by side, and it's very difficult to actually understand who is more intelligent than the other, because they reply in kind. They add a few more abuses than Trump, but this is the level of the discussion and debate taking place, and the culture takes it in the United States. It's not the case that he's universally unpopular. If only that were true. He is not universally unpopular. It's worth remembering that. And then we look at Europe, which, to be frank, is in a mess. I have described Europe since the late 90s as a world of the extreme center. Now, people say extreme left, extreme right. So when I first coined this phrase, people said, but there can't be an extreme center because it's the center. So I said, no, but that's precisely the point. It is an extreme center. It wages wars. It backs American wars. It punishes its own people. It imposes austerity. The way in which the extreme center at the heart of the European Union is punished the people of Greece is quite shocking if you think about it seriously for a minute. So and the point about this extreme center is that whoever wins, whether it's center left or center right, you get the same thing. So that what it is putting into question itself is democracy and the functioning of democracy. And the German sociologist and philosopher Wolfgang Streeck has written some very powerful essays on this theme, saying, I live in the heart of this center. He doesn't say extreme center, but we live in the heart of this center, Germany, where we have had coalition governments right from the beginning of the Cold War, social democrats and conservatives in one government, by and large, and the choice will come again today at the end of the day when we know what the results in Germany are, what form of government is going to be formed, and no one expects people to do anything too different. Now, this has a huge impact on the culture, because in a society where politics is, conformist, mainstream politics is conformist, the culture adapts to it. And the way in which the media has become a complete pillar of this extreme center, the mainstream media. I mean, you're very lucky, I say this totally seriously, to have a newspaper like Klassekampen in this country, which offers intelligent journalism, whether you agree or disagree with it, and which offers occasionally and often a different view. Not many countries in Europe have this. Worth thinking about, how it survived here. I mean, there are different stories to explain that, but whatever the reason, I'm very glad it has survived here. But it's not the case in most of Europe today. So if North America is facing a huge crisis of democracy, so is Europe. We can't pretend that Europe is sort of inherently better, which people used to say 20, 30 years ago. I think it's a lot of mimicry going on in Europe of American culture, of American consumerism, of American architecture in many parts of Europe. Just mimicry. And mimicry is easy, of course, but it can crush real creativity, because creativity depends on the right to fail. You try, you experiment, you produce a very good work twice in your life or 3 times in your life, the others are not as good. But the culture increasingly, by this I mean publishing houses, theaters, many concert halls, the cinema has registered a very sharp decline. I mean, if you compare the cinema that used to be produced with the Italians and the French in particular, but not just them, in Eastern Europe, for instance, in the 60s and 70s and late 50s, and see what is being produced now in most of these countries which once gave us very fine cinema, it is mimicry. The Americans are masters of police shows and crime. The French try and do the same. The Italians try and do the same. The Spanish try and do the same. Scandi Noir, as British television calls it, succeeded because they made some very good television serials. Now everyone is trying to do it to make money, thinking that success, when mimicked, and imitated is also successful, and that is never the case. It's not that the United States doesn't produce good stuff. They have produced in the television world two very interesting serials, very remarkable and better than many things done in Europe. The Wire, for instance, was a wonderful serial, the first attempt to describe American society and different aspects of it. Life in the black ghetto, corruption in politics, how the unions became corrupt and were infiltrated. I mean, the only European filmmaker to try and do a country study like that is Edgar Rice in Heimat, in which he attempted to confront Germany's past, but not in a hysterical way, in a very calm and sober way, to pose questions and sometimes answer them and sometimes leave them unanswered. But that was already a very long time ago. So we are living, I think, in a world of transition. Transition to what? No one quite knows, and we have to be open about that. These are not times of certainties, these are times of sort of uncertainties, and many of us who remain on the left don't do it just because it's a nice thing to do. It isn't. I mean, in many ways it isn't. But to do it, to carry on insisting that hope must not be given up, however dark and however bad the times. And people sometimes say times are very bad, and I say, yeah, their times are very bad. They were worse in the 30s, when German fascism occupied most of Europe. They were much worse, just accept that. So we have not yet reached that stage, and I hope we never will, but but we have reached stages where you can have crazinesses going on the right largely, and then you have the terrorist attacks in most European countries, which are linked, in my mind, very clearly to the wars being waged by the United States and its allies in the EU in the Arab world. I mean, before that, why didn't we have them before that happened? These are all post the occupation of the Arab world, post the first Gulf War. And unless you see it like that, but it's produced very little in the United States in terms of, let's say, a cultural opposition. I was trying to think, as I was traveling here, of one strong, powerful, short novel even, on what is happening in the US and what they're up to in the rest of the world. I couldn't think of any. Of course, people refer to it as a ritual, but there's no real book that has come out of this so far. So the culture that dominates a country is produced not just by small groups of people, but by the overall impact. I give you one example. When I was working on the Lenin book, I was doing a lot of reading on the early years of the revolution, while Lenin was alive, since the book is about him, and the emergence of many currents of cultural divergences and thoughts in which he didn't interfere, nor did they. Within literature, many currents, futurists, constructivists, etc. In cinema, non-constructivist, Eisenstein, constructivist, Vertov. Mayakovsky, very close to the constructivists in his poetry, but above all in architecture. And this is something I had never thought about, to be honest, when I was young in the 60s and 70s, but it struck me now because of the world in which we live. In those years, one took it for granted that the architects, immediately after the revolution, had only one thing in the mind, and no one told them to: how to produce an architecture in which working class families could live nice, contented lives. So the discussions are how to build apartment blocks which workers really need and which are not imposed on them. And this was linked very much at that stage to women's liberation as well, because Lenin used to be angry about women and their traditional roles in society, tied to this bar, doing the washing up, doing the cooking, etc. He said the women are chained in our world today. How to break these chains? And the question the architect said, how do we break these chains? So you build creches inside an apartment block. You build communal dining rooms where the cooking is done in turn by other people, not necessarily the people from one thing, by rotation. You create an open space with a playground which is visible from the big room in each apartment block, so that you keep an eye on the children when they're playing, if you wish to, or even when you're working there, you can keep an eye on the children, or when you're cooking. And these architectural debates reminded me of what is possible and what was possible. Until the 30s, I have to say, it carried on. It wasn't stopped. It did stop. But if you look at some of the designs by the great architects which were never completed, they're absolutely amazing. A young architect, Ivan Leonidov, just a genius. I think only one of his designs was actually constructed, which is a giant staircase in Kislovsk, in the mountainous regions. But he constructed this design of a building which was to be called the Lenin Institute of Librarianship, teaching people how to become librarians. And it's like nothing I have seen from anyone else. And had they built it, I think they were short of funds because it was very extravagant. It was 5 reading rooms, 4 auditoriums, etc., beautifully designed. You know, one was spherical and the other was going straight up like this. And there were links between the two buildings. I mean, it was a work of genius, and he was said, people who saw the design, like Corbusier, they said, this guy is a genius, where is he? But he said, I'm not interested in, he said, I don't want to be a genius. I work best when I work with a group of other people. Because working in a collective, you help each other. My mistakes might look nice, but there might be something crazy. Who's going to, unless we work collectively, nothing is going to change. And that big constructivist current in architecture was, one of the masterminds was Jewish architect Ginsberg, who was the head of the Architectural Association. And when he was asked, where did you get some of these amazing ideas from? There's so much flow in your buildings. He said, I got them from the Crimea, where I lived for 5 years, and I studied Islamic architecture, and I saw the construction of some of the mosques, and I saw how sometimes you enter a mosque in the Crimea, and you feel there's a stream flowing in the heart of it. There isn't. Your imagination feels that. And I wanted to bring some of that design, transform it for some of the work we're doing on building stuff all over the Soviet Union. So the point I'm trying to make is they could only think like that because a huge upheaval had taken place in the Soviet Union. And just to give you exactly the opposite side of it, but very different, but also linked to what was happening. The first time I visited, I went to North Korea twice, once in 71 and once in 72. And the first time I arrived and got off the plane at Pyongyang, my first thought was, I'm not in an Asian country. And spending 2 weeks there, this grew and grew. These looked like Eastern European cities to me. So I said to my hosts, what would you like to do? So I said, is there any old part in the city? And they said, are you mad? Every single dwelling was bombed by the United States from 1950 to 53. But nothing was left. So naturally all this you see is new. So I was a bit cheeky. I said, but could nothing from Your own traditions have been put. They said we didn't have the time, we didn't have the money. And so these architects came from Russia and Eastern Europe and rebuilt it. And you may not like it, but for us it's very important. I said, no, I agree, it's very important that the country was rebuilt. But nothing was left. Think about that. In which every single thing was destroyed. And people who look today at the fight going on, of course, have no idea about this. Which brings history to the fore again, that nothing that happens in the world today is comprehensible without at least understanding a tiny part of the history. And that is where, writing novels, writing plays, on their own they can't do anything. None of us are arrogant enough to think that we write a good thing or we make a good film and it's going to change the world. No, it's not going to change the world, but it's an act of recovery. It's so that people don't forget that these things were possible, because we live in a world which tells us nothing that happened in the 20th century was good. Nothing like that is possible again. Just settle down, be happy, don't worry too much. Your politicians and your bankers are doing the business for you. It's difficult to say that after 2008. And there is a volatility and a nervousness, especially amongst young people who don't know much history but are learning fast and are beginning to see that the world in which they live, this is, I'm talking about Europe, leave alone the rest of the world, that the world in which they live is deeply unsatisfactory. And when sometimes I speak and they ask, well, who's going to change this world? I said, you are. You have to think about it. You know, it's not that we're dead as yet, but we soon will be. But it's your generations that have to devise something new, and you will learn many, many lessons from the past. And soon we will be in 2019, which will be the 70th anniversary of the Chinese Revolution, one of the single most important revolutions in history, triggered off by the Russian Revolution. And what is going to happen to this enormous, amazing country, we don't know. But we know that there is a lot going on. Some of the documentaries, some of the cinema, some of the writings, which most people don't read, largely because they're in Chinese and not distributed, but these things are going on. And the fact that this country is now the center of the world market, like Britain used to be in the 19th century, is going to have some impact. Europe and America are no longer the center of the world market as such. They're important because they produce important things still, and they have a lot of money still. But there's been a wide shift and a growing shift to the East and Far East, and that is where this century probably will be made. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Tariq, you mentioned Korea and how the whole scenario was changed with the Soviet architecture. Things happening in the Middle East now. The Islamic world is totally destroyed. What kind of Soviet or what kind of construction future is it? Is it Islamic organizations, the religious organizations who are going to build those countries again, or?
Well, I mean, this is a very good question, and the answer...
You can speak in the... Yeah.
It's a very good question, and the answer is brief. I don't know. I think there are two big currents now in the Islamic world, leaving aside the United States, which is everywhere. And one is Saudi Arabia, and the other is Iran. I mean, if I had a choice architecturally and culturally, I would opt for Iran any day. I mean, there's no big debate in one's mind on that. But so I think if some Iranian architects come to Iraq to rebuild what is destroyed and which still hasn't been rebuilt,
But you know that Iranians wouldn't be coming there. So Saudians might be deciding what to happen. And it's not only the architect,
No, it's
probably
everything.
for everything else as well,
I don't think the Saudis can run the whole of Iraq. It's impossible. At the most, they will get a bit of Sunni Iraq. Iraq, the way things are going now, Iraq will be divided into three areas. The Sunni Iraq, whether this will go Wahhabi on the Saudi model, I don't know, and I hope not, because it has very rich traditions of its own. Then there is Shia Iraq, mainly in the south, and if the way the Americans are behaving in that country, it's pushing them almost in that direction. And then there is Kurdish Iraq, the northern Iraq. It already is. I mean, effectively, what the Kurdish areas in Iraq are today, it's an Israeli-US protectorate. That's the honest truth. So it's a grim situation in most cases. And what will happen to what's left of Syria, how that will be divided, we just don't know.
Do you people hear or probably any questions, any comments on what has been said so far? There's certainly some.
I'd like to ask Per a question, which is this. You wrote this novel in 2008, quite a long time after the events took place. Did you need that time? You couldn't have written it 2 years afterwards. You needed the time to reflect, or that's how it happened?
Well, I didn't reflect, I think. I just needed it to... Well, I was never going to write that book, was I? Because my mother died in 1990. I had written a couple of books that I couldn't have written when she was alive, because she would have killed me. And I loved my mother. I was very sort of happy with my mother. I admired her because she was working class, did all kinds of working class jobs, but she was an intellectual. She learned me to read. But after I written this book, I was very mad at my mother because I sort of discovered a lot of things. It was not therapy or anything. It was just I realized how harsh she had been because of the life she had led. She was the best in her class in school in a Danish town, and she was not allowed to go to college or anything. Her father said no. So she just moved to Copenhagen, did all kinds of odd jobs, worked in Stockholm. She was going to London, but she was going to Oslo first, and then she got pregnant. And she married this industrial worker, my father. They were very different. She had never been married. But I wrote a book about her life too, in a way. It's called To Siberia, which takes place in late 20s, in the 30s and 40s. And what was interesting with that book is that my mother had a pen friend, in the 30s from Germany. Her whole class was going to correspond with a class in Germany, and they were just those two sort of continuing writing letters, and they did, and suddenly it was stopped after 1939. No more letters, and then suddenly in 1947 they started again, and my mother wanted to visit her, and so they discussed this for years, and then she wanted to go, but then suddenly she lived in East Germany, in Magdeburg, so she couldn't visit her. And so it went on, until in the late 80s she went and visited her, and she was very disappointed in a way, because she, please bring nylon stockings. That was the most political thing her friend said, called Helga. So my mother lived through those political times, and she was very sort of conscious. In one way she hated the English, and then she loved the English, and she really hated the Germans. And when I talked, bad about the Soviet Union, she said, "You don't know anything." Because she didn't support Stalin or anything, but she just knew what it had been like before that. and how, like, under the Tsars, as if from today we look back and it was heaven. It was the prison of the peoples, right? And she knew all this, and I didn't know anything. She could read German, She'd come home from the shifts and she would go to bed, and then she was reading, and I said, "What are you reading?" And she said, "Die Blechtrommel," And she could do all. She read English, Danish, Swedish. She thought I was lazy because I couldn't read German. So I learned a lot from her, of politics, not from my father.
Did your father read at all?
My father, he read the Pulp Fiction, but he had this bookcase that he bought in the 30s, full of great books that he bought. I don't know why he bought them. Maybe he wanted to sort of to rise culturally in a way, because it was the world literature in there.
Yes.
It was just a bookcase, and it was very nice to look at because it had all these colorful book backs. And the children, we thought it was just a piece of furniture because nobody ever took a book out. My mother went to the library each Wednesday, and my father read Pulp Fiction, and it was just one day I sat down, maybe 12, 13 years old, I sat down on the steps in front of it, and I accidentally took out the book. And I opened it, and wow, I could read it, because I could read. So it just was possible to read. It was dull, but that was not the point. The point is I could read it, so I just read it, and it was in the middle of the third volume of War and Peace or something, So I just continued till it was. I didn't go back to the beginning. I just read it. So wow, I could maybe that's the case with the other books here too. And it was Ibsen, and it was Dostoevsky, and it was this Bergen and Nice 100 years edition of Tolstoy. So I just read it. I thought because I could, So I thank my father for that, but he never touched the books, and my mother never touched the books because it was his, I guess. So I sort of I brought myself up with reading, and I thought it was just me who did, because I saw nobody else that read books like that. So I thought I was the only one. I mean, in the town who read books, but I never saw anyone else. Of course there was, but I didn't think there was, so I didn't speak with them. So I thought I was alone. And that's a good way to read, I think, the solitary reader. It's me and the book. I thought that was pretty nice there, really. So I had something on my own. Yes. Okay.
Per,
No, I just want to ask one more question, which is this, that many of us on the left, especially when we were young, just assumed that all the great literature was produced by people on our side, and the right was incapable of writing anything. And then as one gets older, you suddenly come across a book, and it's written by someone who's not only right, but very far to the right. And it's absolutely brilliant. I'm
like
thinking
Celine,
of
you
Celine.
mean? Yeah, Celine and Knut Hamsun?
No, not exactly.
Sure, they were two fascists.
Two fascists who wrote amazing stuff.
Hamsun is definitely my favorite
Hamsun,
writer.
didn't Hamsun, when he got the Nobel Prize for Literature, fly to Berlin and
He gave it to
offer
Goebbels.
it to Hitler? He gave it to Goebbels.
To Goebbels as a present, yes.
That's is it better
So
than
it's
Hitler,
all this
maybe?
debate going on since the war that Hamsun, finally we have to, rehabilitate him, but we can't.
Yeah.
Every time somebody tries to name a street, a square, make put him on a plinth,
You can't do
you
it.
can't do it. You want to, but you can't do it. You can't put a Nazi on a plinth. You can't name a square after a Nazi. He was a Nazi. He supported the Nazi party, not just the NS, which was the collaborative party in Norway. He supported Hitler. He went to see Hitler.
Yeah.
So there's no excuse. And there shouldn't be an excuse,
No.
because that would be unfair to Knut Hamsun.
Yeah.
He meant this.
He did.
And he was brilliant. He was our best novelist ever. No one like him ever.
Jean-Paul Sartre once said about Celine that this bastard is a genius who is going to outlast us all.
Yes. He's a great writer. He was a great
Great
writer.
writer.
Fantastic.
And sometimes, looking at the world today, especially the European world, you just feel, where is Celine? Not the fascist Celine, but the writer Celine. Where is that utterly uncontrollable anger which is needed?
Maybe it's there.
Yeah.
We haven't seen him.
Yeah, it's very possible.
Yep.
Any comments, any questions from? I just wanted to ask, Tariq, you have written now over 24 of books. Some of them are novels.
Mostly non-fiction.
Mostly non-fictions. Fear of mirrors and
That is fiction.
that is fiction. You have the pomegranate tree, that is fiction. Some others are fiction. Do you see the response different from what you wrote in fiction than the other books that you have written? Or the impact of it? Because like some people say that probably the fiction is the best place where you can put reality or see reality.
Yeah. Well, it's a very different form of writing. Essays, non-fiction, essays and fiction. I mean, fiction drags things out of you as you're writing, which you didn't even know were hidden there. That's the most, and it comes, it happens, and through, from the late 80s, for much of the 90s, when I started writing fiction in the Islam Quintet, and I would go to countries where I was not known at all, except by the 60s generation, and there'd be literature festivals in Germany where they would just discuss the fiction. And then at one of these meetings, I think at the book fair in Munich, there was a guy sitting at the back whose face was vaguely familiar, and as I was reading from my book, I watched him staring at me, and I said, his face is familiar, who the hell is he? And he was, older than me even. And suddenly he stood up, and I remembered, he was an old Marxist professor from Berlin University. And he said, Tariq, you're not going to get away with hiding your old identity, I'm going to tell all these young people who you are. I said, that's fine by me. I'm not hiding it. It's just, a waste of time telling them, because then you have to explain a lot of other things. But they got very interested as a result. But so it goes. Yeah. Hi.
My name is Christopher. I am a professional as a political cartoonist. I work in all the newspapers around the world.
Can you give that?
Yeah.
Le Monde and like this. I was in
If you can speak
Turkey
in the mic,
2 days ago. I'm original Turkish, Norwegian. I was very afraid to come into the country nowadays. Even you don't see this situation too many.
Sorry, is everybody listening?
Well, can they hear him?
Do you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, fine. No.
Yeah.
And when I came in the country and go out the country, I was afraid. And I was thinking the Jews and the Nazi times, as you talk, the old times and all the discussions around it. And this fear that people create, and the left side doesn't do anything about it, I think, because we live with this fear and we are very depressed around the world nowadays. The question is this fear, why we talk about fascism, we talk about the European way, but not the way that they act in the history and nowadays.
Well, I don't think that is totally accurate. I mean, to give you one example, there were huge demonstrations all over Europe and the United States to try and stop the Iraq War. But huge, millions of people came out. because they knew, and this was before the war had even begun, because they knew the politicians were lying. They knew Bush was lying, Blair was lying, that this whole thing of weapons of mass destruction was a fantasy. And they tried to stop it. And when the war still went ahead, many people lost hope because, they were a new generation of people, and including many citizens who were not even on the left, but who knew the politicians were lying. So people then do get demoralized easily because there's nothing permanent there which can carry on the work when they've gone home. I mean, the left has suffered huge sets of defeats, the total collapse of the Soviet Union. It's not that one liked that society or that it was an ideal socialist society, but for millions of people throughout the world, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the space it generated globally for people, ordinary people, working people, peasants said this is the end, there's nothing left if this country which believed in something progressive is gone. And in Pakistan in particular, when people talk about China today, they say, but look how strong China is, they've gone, it's because they've become capitalist. Well, they wouldn't have become capitalists in this particular way had there been no Chinese Revolution. And you can then explain to people that a lot of the industries in China are controlled by the state. And that is, they all say, not going to change. Not everything, but quite a lot of industries are controlled by the state. But in any case, the 90s were a huge defeat, a huge triumph for capital globally, and the left suffered. And then you take with that the deindustrialization that has taken place, and is still taking place. The country, I just give you a tiny example, a country like Croatia joins the EU, they have to follow its directive. So you have a town with 200,000 people, 2 factories which employ most of the working population. They are ordered to close 1 factory down. They do it, and half the town is unemployed. What do you do? And there's no one there. I mean, the old politicians have sold out, corruption is rife to do anything. So there is a huge vacuum. And the right has been more effective in jumping into this vacuum and creating something, and our side has been weak. This is why I really was very happy when I arrived in Norway and was told that the Red Party had won a member of parliament. I was thrilled. I said, thank God. And these sort of small developments are taking place everywhere. So it's not that everything is lost. If you look at the Turkish situation, which is particularly depressing, I mean, people have suffered, fought against military dictatorships. They've been, virtually all the intellectuals one respects in Turkey have served their time in prison. Etc., etc. The same thing is now happening under a democratic regime. Democratic in the sense it's been elected. There's no way around that. I mean, it's just a fact. I mean, like Trump has been elected. So people simply have no idea what needs to be done, what they're going to do, what type of organizations they need today. We're living in a period of transition. Still a lot of work to be done, and the new generations will, I'm confident, come up with something, because much has changed. The way of communication has changed. When we were young, you had to leave little things lying in secret to convey things in dictatorships. Today you can just communicate in 2 minutes. Though given the degree of surveillance now, they might have to go back to older means of communication to prevent the secret state from reading your letters. You might have to do it. But it's just that a great deal has changed. We can't go back to where we were. The world has moved on. The question is how to relate to this world. and how to fight within this world for a better way of life. These are the discussions people are taking that are taking place. I mean, the question of climate change, for instance, which is a huge question globally, but is even a more, sort of minimum degree of change possible without a planned society, not just in a single country, but on a world scale. Can you do it? How can you do it unless there's collaboration from other countries, etc.? If you think that that is the biggest problem facing the world, then with that, the solution only lies in a planned economy of some sort on a world scale. And to even mention the word planned economy, they say you're a totalitarian and authoritarian, this, that, and the other. But that's the reality.
Thank you. And I just wondered if we should take a break, or because there have been some other questions.
Well, I think if people ask their questions, then we can take a final break.
Fine. Okay.
Sorry, hello. My name is Pashialnis. I work and live in Oslo. I was caught by what you were saying about developing our future and which direction we're going to go in. And I've
Could you put your mic closer to you?
Oh, I've often thought about the rise of nationalistic and populistic right-wing movements in many Western European countries. And one country where there's, in a sense, an absence is the one country that has had a lifetime experience of fascism, namely Spain. Although maybe there are, I'm sure, right-wing movements in Spain, but they don't feature in the same way on the political radar, at least in the media. I just wondered whether having had a lifetime of experience of fascism has in some way immunized them from seeking that sort of direction in their future, whereas many European countries have flirted with the idea of fascism and nationalism, but had these ideas truncated within a generation because of the end of World War II. I'm just curious of your thoughts around that.
I don't think it's that, actually. I mean, even in Germany, who are obsessed by their past, not fascist past, there are far-right groups. We'll see tonight how well the AfD has done. I mean, if they get 10%, it's a huge regression in Germany. And there are many, many other currents inside German society today. Of course, one has to stress they're minorities, very small minorities. But they've, over the years, been carrying out what? Burning of Vietnamese people in former East Germany, attacks on Turks in people of Turkish origin in West Germany, linked to elements of the police, etc., etc. So it happens there. The country you mentioned, Spain, is a very special country. There, to be totally frank with you, the Franco regime was, after Franco died and they were remodeling the state, most of the Franquistas went into the PP, the Conservative Party in Spain. That is where they went, and that is where their successors still are, because most of the Franquistas are now old and dying. A case where one can only thank that the laws of biology exist. But their successors are embedded in there. If you look at the reaction of the PP to the Catalans, for instance, it's horrific, really. It's repeating things which have been done to the Catalans, not just by Franco, but by de Rivera's dictatorship before that. So it's there. It doesn't come out in a crude form as it does in some other parts of Western Europe, but Europe as a whole. I mean, in Hungary and parts of Eastern Europe, you have the open idolization of former leaders of these countries who collaborated with the Nazis. That is happening in Hungary. It's happening to a certain extent in Croatia. It is there's a third country where some of these things are going on. Ukraine, the Ukraine, where they're really honoring and naming streets after. I mean, Per was saying that in Norway it's impossible to name a street after Hamsun, who was, leaving aside his appalling political views, a writer of genius. But this is actual fascists who had no qualities whatsoever, except that they collaborated with the Nazis. And the communist resistance in some cases defeated them, and the Red Army in the other. These people are now being worshipped as heroes, and no one says too much about it because it's embarrassing. That is the price being paid for the new ideology that was imposed, that as long as you support neoliberalism, everything else is forgiven. So, but what I wanted to say to you was, it is not just the extreme right. Please, there are other things going on. In France, people got obsessed. Is Le Pen going to win? Very few of us who know France well knew that she would win. She was used as a threat to make sure that you had an extreme center president in Macron or banker. A classic example of all this, and that Mélenchon was not the candidate who took on Le Pen. That would have put real pressure on the French elite. And so the big campaign against Mélenchon, Jean-Luc Mélenchon in France, in the mainstream media, before the first round of the elections, to make sure that the runoff wasn't between him and Le Pen. Once they'd succeeded in that, they rode home, but Mélenchon got a very large percentage of the vote, the largest vote the left has received in France since 1969. And currents like this, are emerging. Young people are getting very angry about what's going on, and there is some change. So I'm not as pessimistic as some people are.
Well, there are three other questions which has been sent before you came, which I thought probably if we can give just few minutes to them.
Okay.
One was whether it was sent by someone from here, whether Turkey is now becoming another Iran, in a sense that the secular values are being taken on a side and religious values are coming up. The other question was what is happening in India and Pakistan, especially after the 70 years of independence after colonialism. Things are probably happening more in India than in Pakistan. And the third was the whole wave of migration and the whole issue of migration, which is coming up so much. So these are three huge topics, but I guess if you can spend just few minutes on each, it will probably help. And then we skip the break, then we can have the final break.
Okay. Well, Turkey, it's true. The Turkish party in power and Erdogan,
If it's okay.
Were regarded as the best sort of Islamists by the United States. They were NATO's favorites. This is the model because they were moderate, etc., etc. But in order to complete that process, they should have been. I'm not saying that I agree with that assessment. I'm just saying that is what the Western leaders thought. But despite that, they wouldn't let them into the European Union. And that pushed Erdogan more and more to extreme fundamentalism because he said, they don't think we're good enough to be in the European Union. So, okay, screw them. We'll do now what we want to do. And he's doing that. And why shouldn't they be in the European Union? There's only one reason, that it's a Muslim country. I can't see any other reason when you think of many other states which are embedded now in the European Union. And interestingly enough, just a small digression on this was also a question posed by, even before Putin came to power, Yeltsin and before him Gorbachev said to the West, now that the old rivalry is over, why can't we be in the European Union? And Yeltsin said, why can't we be in NATO? We want to join NATO. Well, I mean, they didn't realize that they sort of made a laughing stock of these bodies for the West. But in the case of Turkey, the reason was very clear. That is what they were trying to prevent, to keep Europe monocultural as far as the dominant culture was concerned and religion. So that what happened in the 15th century with the expulsion of the Jews and of the Muslims some decades later, which created Europe as we know it now, couldn't be reversed. And this then made Erdogan more and more recalcitrant. And then they tried to topple him. Now, it's still debated who was behind the coup. Whether it was Gulen, a rival Islamist backed by the CIA, who lives in the United States and had lots of people in the army, in the judiciary, in the police force over the years, or whether whoever, I don't know. But that a serious attempt was made to topple him, and after that he became more hardline. And by the way, I have no time for him, but just to give some objectivity here. By the way, often in his speeches he quotes from Nazim Hikmet's poems, which he loves and knows by heart, this guy. So he knows how to talk to the people. You know, he'd break into a poem by Nazim Hikmet and say, yeah, he was a communist, so what, that's in the past, he's dead now, etc. He's a great poet, a great Turkish poet. So, but the answer is yes, they are trying to make the society, Turkish society, more religious. The interesting question is, will they succeed? Because secularism in Turkey does go quite deep, especially in the cities. And I don't think he's stupid enough to enforce it, you know. So we will see. India, Pakistan, after 70 years, what can one say? You know, it's been a disaster story on both sides. I feel maybe I should write a book called Midnight's Bastards. But you know, you all know, I mean, those of you who want to, we have an extreme right-wing government in India, which is semi-fascist. It's elected, it's popular, but it's semi-fascist. Journalists are being targeted now, critical journalists, and killed by these people. And the interesting situation in India is this, that behind the BJP, which is the official party, is the RSS, which was an organization created in the late 20s and 30s and modeled itself on the Nazis and the Mussolini's fascists. They saw Mussolini as a very good model for them. But they were Hindu chauvinists and Hindu nationalists, so they hated the Gandhi and Nehru and were responsible for ordering the assassination of Gandhi. The RSS did it, and when about 20 years ago, one of my television people, the team I had got, interviewed the brother of the assassin and said, now so much time has passed, do you regret the fact that your brother assassinated Mahatma Gandhi? He said, no, we are proud of him, he's a martyr. So, you know, they are very hardline and they control the government. Modi doesn't do anything without the central body of this organization, the RSS, giving its approval. And they never believed they could have success. They've been working for, and they said when the BJP won, the RSS said, we have been working for 50 years to achieve this result. 50 years. And we are almost there, but not complete. And now what they are doing is much worse than the Turks, to be perfectly honest with you, in terms of the assaults and attacks on Muslim minority, Christian minority, low caste, so-called low caste Hindus or Dalits as they are known. That is all going. They want to homogenize India. And the whole beauty about the old Hindu religion was that you couldn't homogenize it, because there were many, many different currents of thought within it. And they feel that to compete on a global scale, they have to have something like Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, which goes completely against the grain of this, ancient religion, which coexisted with Roman religions. It's a pagan religion, in effect, the Hindu religion. So they're trying to, and they're doing it very viciously. But because they're also great supporters of the existing world order, neoliberalism, that's fine. Not a problem as long as you support the system. Don't damage the global system, and you can do what you like. That is the message that goes out from the West. And Pakistan, as you know, there are political parties now. There's a dominant political party, which is, the country for many years now has been swathed in corruption. It's like a sheet of water in which the country drowns. And the corruption starts at the top and percolates all the way down to the bottom on the lowest levels of society. They are not responsible for it. The army is corrupt, the political parties are corrupt. Attempts to stop it have failed because the army has stopped them at key points. You talk to, some years ago I was talking to a retired Indian army general, and he said, "Tell me, what is it about Pakistan? Your generals are blessed by God." I said, "What?" He said, "When we retire, we get a 2-bedroom apartment in a big, ugly apartment block, and that's where we'll spend the rest of your lives. Your generals get huge tracts of land where they build, billion-dollar homes." I said,
Paradise.
"Well, that's the advantage of having run the country for so long, that, they know it." So there is really, at the moment, very little hope in these two countries. What was the last question?
Immigration.
Huh?
Immigration, because I think...
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, the immigration question is, it's not going to go away. I have to say that when Angela Merkel said 1 million refugees are welcome, I was very surprised. For any European politician to stand up and say this, right or left, is pretty courageous. But then they retreated quickly, as her party said, do you want to lose the election? So she retreated and instead said to Erdogan in Turkey, who she claims to hate, said, "How many billions do you want to keep the refugees in Turkey?" And he gave a price, and he was paid most of it. So these poor refugees now saying, well, Turkey is even worse than Syria, the way we have to live. Some of them are going back to Syria. So there are two levels of migration. One is economic migration, which is as old as the world. The whole history of the world is a history of migration. But when Europeans migrated to the Americas, that was fine. They were good immigrants. But when Africans or Asians migrate to Europe, they are bad immigrants because you're not working hard enough. And the reasons the Europeans migrated abroad was exactly the same as migration today. No jobs, famines, economic disasters, political repression. Most of the English migrants who went in the Mayflower and established what later became were fleeing from repression at the hands of, Catholics who were trying to recover, or soft Protestants. The Puritans were the ones who went, the Wahhabis of the English Revolution, who went to the United States first. And the German-Italian migrations to the United States, which came in later centuries, was due to no jobs. Why did the Italians leave beautiful Sicily to go and, to Chicago, where the winters are intolerable? That's why. Why do migrants from the West Indies or India and Pakistan come to Britain? It's not because they like rain. They do it because they see no other option. And that form of migration, which they're trying to stop, partially successfully, I don't think they can stop it. People find other means to do it. The other migration is, of course, which is linked to wars. And I think if the European Union had leaders of vision, or the Europeans did, even those outside the Union, they would say to the United States, we're not going to back your wars. I mean, they should say that anyway. But if you insist on going to war, we demand indemnity. Add to each war you fight billions and billions of dollars to pay us, so we can then create conditions to welcome the refugees that these wars will create. I mean, there would have been no Syrian refugees had there been no war, no Iraqi refugees, no Afghan refugees. And Norwegians have to ask themselves, what is this tiny little country doing fighting? What was it doing fighting in Afghanistan? Just to sort of suck up to the Americans. There's no reason to do it. I mean, those who thought this was to do with feminism are the ones I have total contempt for. Because go to Afghanistan today and ask any woman who is not working for an NGO, what is the condition of women in Afghanistan, and you get a very sharp, clear reply. Rapes have increased. Even the awful Taliban, the one thing they had virtually stopped was rape because of their extreme ways of doing it. You are caught raping someone, execution. Well, I'm not in favor of that, of course, because they're a deeper problem. But still, they did. It went down. Today it's high again. Massive importation of brothels and prostitution into these countries. Young girls taken and enslaved. These are things Europeans don't read about because they're never written about in the press. But they've completely destroyed the social fabric of that country. And this war's now been going on in Afghanistan longer than the First and Second World Wars put together. Just think about that.
Hello, I want Per to also comment on the immigration issue, because the place you write about in the book, Veitvet, is very different now from when you grew up there, or if you live there. And also the Norwegian left's confusion or lack of eagerness to talk about immigration. Can you also comment on that? Thank you.
Well, I've just been talking about immigration.
She asks me.
Ah, sorry. sorry.
Well, I'm not like Tariq Ali, so I cannot answer all these questions. But of course, Veitvet is quite a different place. I was reading there like 2 days ago. But of course, that was the history thing. They have this little history group of Veitvet, and there were only white people there, of course, because they knew me even though I was at school. So no others came. But a couple of friends of mine from school still live there, and I went to see one of them not that long ago, and I said, "You never moved, did you?" "No, I didn't." "Well, what do you think of living here?" "It's great, but too many Pakis," he said. Which is a way of talking that was, I thought it was from the 70s that you said things like that. Mm. So I thought Veitvet is pretty interesting now. It's like 50-50. But I would never live there again, not because of that, but because you can't go back. Some people I know have tried, and they say, I just forgot how lousy childhood I had at Veitvet. So I guess it's true about migrations, refugees, that the left has never sort of handled that question because they really don't know. And I don't know because we have Listhaug on the one side, and then we have more like the people saying, let them all come, like Jesus, let them all come to me. But you can't, can you? You can't let everybody come, because that will sort of topple our system, the democracy. You have to have a sort of system in a society, and if it's flooded, you can't have that system. But I'm not like Listhaug, so I just support a clear-minded human way of doing it, because we have to have more refugees into Norway. Now everybody's turned out. It's not like anybody's coming because of this right-wing coalition that we have. So and it's very embarrassing. Though I'm not a representative of the left here. I'm not really sure where I am. I am left, of course. I voted for Rødt. But I did it outside Oslo, so it had no effect. That's all. So that's not an answer, I guess. But it's a difficult thing. Migration is difficult because it's new for us in a way. When I worked in a factory for several years. At the beginning and middle of the 70s, and my best friends there were from India and Pakistan, and the one who sort of ran the machine I was working on, he was from Morocco, he and his friend. I met them just some weeks ago, and they don't know Norwegian yet. That's a problem. And it was, the tone was pretty good. And some of them really were pretty good. Especially one from India, he was very good Norwegian, but I know that his grandchildren are not. So that's a strange thing happening. And I know white children who are not so good in Norwegian because where they live. And this is unsolved. This is a thing that is not solved in Norway. And I think to know the language of the country you are in is very, very important because of, amongst other things, literature. If you can't read literature, you have very important thing about identity is close to you. So you learn it on the streets. And that's not always the best place. Yeah.
To learn the language, yeah.
To learn a language. It's not because it's kind of a pseudo language.
It takes, I think, 4 to 5 generations, if not more, for migrant communities to be established. I mean, if you look at the Italian migration to the United States, I mean, you had ghettos, you had Italian areas, you had all that. As late as the 1990s, when Mario Cuomo, the mayor of New York, was thinking of running as the president of the United States, Bill Clinton said America's not yet ready to have a president with a name which ends with a vowel.
Ooh.
This is Bill Clinton.
So
the Italians had been there by this time for a long, long time and established themselves in virtually every, and America in any case is a country largely of migrants. So it does take some time. And also, I remember once there was an Asian member of parliament in Britain who turned out to be I'm not going to mention names, who turned out to be a total creep, corrupt, and this, that, and the other. And people got very angry with him, especially from within the migrant communities. And I was at a meeting, and I said, but why are you so angry? He belongs to such and such a party. All of them are more or less like that. Why should he be different just because his skin color is different? Just think about it. They can't all be on the left if they are integrating. I mean, to see a Asian or a West Indian reading an ultra-right-wing paper, The Sun, on the London Tube is not a pleasant sight, but large numbers of people do read it. And in a way, it's a form of integration, whether you like it or not. They are being integrated into society.
My question was about the CPAC. Is the CPAC going to do any miracle that can bring prosperity to the downtrodden people of Pakistan?
Is the what?
CPAC.
Seed bag? The China, okay, sorry.
CPAC?
Yeah. Well, the Chinese have offered, because there's a huge amount of trade now going on. There always was, but its scale is increased. And in the port of Gwadar, which is a free port, the Chinese are using that because they don't want to use the ports on the Gulf, which are totally under the control of the United States. And in return for all this, they are actually offering to build Pakistan an infrastructure, modernize everything, forms of communication. And this is something that no Pakistani government has succeeded in doing. In fact, things have got worse, consistently worse, apart from for the elite. So you build a huge motorway from Lahore to Islamabad, and only people in cars can go who can afford to pay the toll. You know, buses don't go on that either. So if that happens, I think purely in terms of some development which is useful for everyone, a proper railway system, it's positive. What other demands they will put on the Pakistani government, I don't know, but I think there was a lot of anger that they were going to bring a lot of Chinese workers to do the key points of construction. They said it's because they are used to them, they don't trust the local people. From a polite way of saying that too much money has to go to middlemen before anything is done in Pakistan, which means corruption. And that in order to avoid this, we're going to do things differently. But your guess is as good as mine as to what will ultimately happen on this.
Thank you. Then I think thanks very much Per Peterson and Tariq Ali.
More?
I was just wondering what you think about the recent dismissal of the Prime Minister, disqualification in Pakistan. Do you think that was part of the military establishment's grand plan, or how do you see that?
Well, on the face of it, the question which one should be asking is, how has it taken them such a long time to discover that Nawaz Sharif is corrupt? I mean, the whole country knows it. He's corrupt, his brother's corrupt, the entire family is corrupt, they've been making money, they've been looting the banks from the first time the guy came to power. So finally the Panama deposits gave people who wanted it the reason to go after him, and they got him out. Possibly, his supporters say that the army got him out. But possibly, but the question is why have they got someone better? Or was he annoying them too much on refusing to recognize that things had changed in India and carrying on? Nawaz Sharif is basically a businessman, not a politician. He always has been. And he's used politics very effectively to further his business interests and is very proud of it. And he says that. And the fact that he made his wife stand in the constituency he had to give up because of the corruption charges, and she didn't participate in the constituency at all. His daughter did. She fought the campaign for her mother, and they won narrowly in their heartland. The Punjab shows that support is leaking, and that the fact that he can't even unite with his brother at the moment, because the brother was meant to get the constituency and the prime ministership. And people in Lahore were telling me that the reason they want family control over the prime ministership is because two very big contracts are going through, and once they're through, then they could leave. That's the way that country is run. It's not just them who are corrupt, by the way. The PPP under Zardari was just as corrupt. So it's a rivalry to work out. I mean, perhaps both of them should have been given the Nobel Prize for Peace.
Well, thank you very, very much.